Welcome to Let's Talk, a show about talking to kids about race and racism. I'm your host, Karen Tao. In this episode, I meet with Christy and Jake. Christy's an elementary school counselor at a Title I school, and Jake is a psychologist. They're raising their two sons, Jack, age 6, and Will, age 3. Some of the things we talk about are the importance of following their children's lead.
When we try to kind of teach them a lesson and they say no, and we keep forcing the issue, they're not going to want to engage in that.
And recognizing they don't have all the answers.
Even with my own kid, I stumble sometimes on the right words to use or analogies to use or push it a little too far, but I don't have to be the expert. Just from my own personal experience, having been in my early 20s when I first maybe understood the concept of white privilege and then the kind of the impact of that looking back on, my whole life thus far. It's just something that I wish that somebody would have talked to me earlier on to help me understand so that I could have made maybe some better choices or, made some changes in relationships that I had that would really value a whole person's experience.
I think I started thinking more deeply about these in my 20s as well. And maybe for the first 10 years or something that I started thinking about this stuff, I was very uncomfortable. I had the values. I wanted to be seen and experienced as an ally for social justice. I was also really afraid of making a mistake or messing up somehow and not being seen as that. And I think that fear was uncomfortable and in some situations caused me to avoid acknowledging my own experiences or being scared to enter into difficult conversations. And I see that largely as a product of not having conversations growing up. And I'm hoping that kind of by having these open and encouraging and curious conversations with my kids, that they build up experiences having difficult conversations and don't shy away from it.
I definitely say something that I've learned and continue to learn is that I don't have to be the expert because even with my own kid, I stumble sometimes on the right words to use or analogies to use or push it a little too far. But what I found is just if you're just open to the conversation, I get so much out of it, and it's building the venue for having the back and forth conversation and knowing that it's okay to bring up whatever you're experiencing and talk it out with somebody who actually cares.
Yeah,
it's a non-shaming, just kind of trying to learn and understand what they're thinking and hear their thoughts and get them to kind of share their feelings and curiosities, because I love hearing how they think about things.
Yeah, and I think that theme has been pretty consistent with other parents that I've talked to, this idea of letting our kids take the lead. And as parents, there's this, I don't know, this is maybe some ideas that I've been brought up with, that we're the experts and we know better and we know best, and so we should be able to decide when to have a conversation, when not to. I think more and more I'm unlearning some of that.
Right.
Oh yeah.
And I think around certain topics or domains of parenting, I put more intention into creating an environment that the kids want to learn in, and this would be one of them.
I would just say to other parents, like, don't worry about knowing everything or feeling like you have to have everything exactly right.
Yeah.
Just be open to it and go with it.
Yeah, we don't have to be the expert, that they can sometimes be the expert too.
And that we make mistakes.
And that we make mistakes.
Yes.
Absolutely. And that can also teach us.
Right.
Because they bring up and think about the world in such different ways than we do. And it sounds like you as a couple talk a lot about these issues and think through like how it is that you want to have these conversations.
I think both of us have wanted to provide and wanted to have more conversation around race so that they understand both their own white privilege aspect of it, and also other people's experiences and be able to recognize that.
And I think that the more we're able to have these conversations without shame and with some curiosity and openness and humility, the less taboo it will be to have these conversations, and hopefully the more kind of change we can all find within ourselves and our communities.
Absolutely.
And I want him to also just understand that differences are to be celebrated. What he said coming home one day is, there's me and 3 other people in my class who speak English at home. And I'm like, that's awesome. You know,
Yeah,
that's such
yeah.
a great experience for him.
That exposure, I think, is key. And there are a lot of emotions that keep us from having these kinds of conversations about race and racism. I mean, sometimes we feel a lot of shame and guilt.
Yeah, racist it seems to have become like a dirty word or something, or race and racism and racist, and nobody wants to hear it, nobody wants to talk about it, especially from the white community.
Growing up in the South, I always understood racism to be very, using the N-word or, treating somebody very badly, something that's very public, very easy to identify.
Right.
Interestingly enough, very recently we were talking with Jack about racism, and he made the comment, that's something only bad people do. And it kind of reminded me of my own thoughts as a child. It's either this or that.
Christy, you work in an elementary school, and
Right.
so you have a lot of interactions with kids of all various ages. So I wonder if, like, what those experiences are like, because these are not your own kids.
When I was talking about anti-bullying and anti-discrimination in a kindergarten classroom, I brought up a very simple definition of, it's not okay to treat others badly because of the color of their skin. And I've said this in, classroom after classroom, and one little kindergartner just raised her hand and she goes, yeah, that's racist. And I'm like, you're right, you are.
Yeah.
And I think inside I had this little like, oh, is it okay to say that word? And I'm like, well, that is what it is, and I'm so
Right.
grateful that she was able to just pop in and say that. And clearly
Absolutely.
she's had those conversations at her house.
Yes.
So.
Yeah. I love that idea that kids are more willing to say it out loud, and we
Yeah.
as an adults, we have been socialized to not say the R word, not say race,
Sure.
not even the word race. People equate as as racist
Right.
by saying the word. Then we're
Right.
being racist. And then here we have a 5-year-old who's just calling it what it is.
Yeah.
And I think that when we call it what it is and we talk about it with our kids in direct and real ways, we take away its power as well. Think about racism in that way as well. If we say, oh, the R word, then we give it more power.
Yeah.
And our kids think about it like, oh, we can't talk about it.
Right.
Because we're whispering it or we're using other language to just name what it is.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
they're willing to go there.
Another experience I had with another elementary student wasn't down because he used the N-word. And when I sat down and talked to him, I said, what does this word mean to you? And he's, I don't know. I just heard it from someone else. And so we had a little conversation about what is the history of this word. But by, again, having a conversation with an education background, he was like, oh, wow, okay. So that kind
And
of makes a
kids,
difference.
when you say don't say it,
They want to say it.
they want to say
Yes.
it. And so by you having this conversation, the process of let's talk about this word and
Yeah.
let's know where it comes from and its meaning and its impact. It just provided a model for him of we can talk about this stuff. It's not taboo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Sometimes when I teach class, at the beginning of class, I ask folks to raise their hand if they talked about race in their families. And out of that, usually only a few folks who are white raise their hands. And then I ask the follow-up question of, when you talked about race, did you talk about your own race or did you talk about somebody else's race? And most of the time, it's about somebody else's race.
Right.
When I think about raising both Jack and Will, I want them to understand their own race and in that context, socially and historically. And not all negatively,
Sure.
to have positive thoughts about it, but also to have realistic and historically contextualized understandings about it.
One thing I wanted to just sort of touch in on is this idea of white privilege. We hear that word a lot, privilege, and for a lot of folks, it can have can conjure up some kind of resistance or feelings about it, sometimes negative, because some people who are white don't have privilege in some ways. And so, can you help me understand how you're talking about that idea of privilege?
I think of privilege as advantages that are bestowed upon somebody often based on identities. And race is one of those identities that some folks get privileges bestowed upon them by society, by law, by specific interpersonal interactions, by the way people react to your name on a paper. It can be any number of things that kind of systematically advantage folks and systematically disadvantage other folks. Jack is very smart, and he's talking about race in complex ways, but he still often talks about racism as a historical happening, that slavery ended and Martin Luther King happened and the civil rights movement kind of worked. And I want him to understand how there's this long-term legacy of privilege and disadvantages in our society that are continuing to play out today, so that he can see them and hopefully work towards a more socially just world.
Yeah, and along the lines of social justice, when I think about, a lot of the kids that I work with and the fact that they do have those dinner conversations about what to do if they're ever stopped by police, because that's it poses more of a risk for them than it does for my child. It's not fair that that's only put upon children of color. Like, my child needs to have conversations to understand this stuff too.
We're talking here in Utah, and the demographic is definitely changing and diversifying racially and ethnically. And I wonder, sort of outside of school and in other spaces, kind of what are your kids noticing about kind of who's around them?
There's certainly times when my children have acted in ways that if they were adults, I would have called racist. But the way that I respond to it is trying to kind of acknowledge what it is as through most of the time empathy building, I think, just helping my kids kind of understand how that might impact somebody else and think through that, and then find kind of alternative ways of either expressing it or connecting with somebody else.
Hard sometimes
It is.
when, like you're in the grocery store and your child points at somebody and your immediate reaction is just like, oh my God, like, don't do this. And then you have to go back and say, wonder what you were thinking when you were putting that. But they do notice, you can ask them, like, what color is your skin? What color is their skin? And they notice, they can tell you, just like eyes and hair color and everything else. So the teachers that our kids have had at daycare have been wonderfully diverse. And we have 2 teachers of the same name but very different appearance, and we've had to say, you don't call them the brown one and the white one.
Right.
You use their name and their last initial or other identifiers about these wonderful people.
And I mean, this is really kind of where we're at with Will right now, being 3 years old. I think we were just having a conversation this morning where he used a racial identifier, and we asked what else, and we talked about different eye color and different hair lengths and different hairstyles and different clothes, and he was able to kind of pick them all out, different body shapes. And he was just kind of naming it, and it was just kind of this fun activity of kind of joining and noticing all the differences, and being kind of nice and kind and interested about it.
Yeah. Kids at a very, very young age, they're able to have those conversations when we open up that space.
But along those lines, I want to make, I'm really conscious that I don't want to make these conversations something that he wants to avoid.
Right.
Which is why kind of following their lead is so critical and joining in their curiosity. When we try to kind of teach them a lesson and they say no, and we keep forcing the issue, they're not going to want to engage in that.
And you say, you use the term empathy and building and connection.
Right.
And I mean, sometimes we hurt other people with our words.
Right.
And that's part of being human. We're always we're going to hurt someone.
Right.
And so I'm thinking through this with my own kids of how we can sort of distinguish between intention and impact.
Oh, wow.
Right? That idea that I might inadvertently kick you in the shin, and then I say, oh, I didn't mean to. I didn't see your shin there, but you're still hurting. And so when we think about like racism and how at times it can be unintentional, but the impact is still, it's hurtful.
Yeah, we've had conversations too where Jack has pointed out differences in abilities and appearance, and we look at the words that he uses sometimes and say, like, what do you think? How do you think it feels to somebody else if you're saying, oh, they were born wrong, as opposed to they were born with a different arm, and he's like, well, my friend said it, not me. But I'm like, yeah, but how do you think they felt?
Sure.
So just to kind of put themselves in their shoes and think through it.
More than anything, I want them to kind of have a humble curiosity about other people and how they feel, and to acknowledge that although they can be thinking that they're kind, that they can still make mistakes, and to be able to acknowledge that without a whole bunch of shame, but to build their ability to empathize with another person's experience.
I want to underscore that idea of humility and being humble, that we always have more to learn.
There's so many opportunities in our city alone to celebrate other cultures and differences, that it's awesome to take our kids to these different kinds of events and teach them, like, don't be colorblind, like acknowledge the differences and value those and celebrate those.
Yes.
And to see the value in kind of being able to talk about that and think about that and talk to us about it.
Yeah.
I think most importantly.
Yes.